Byzantine society developed a highly sophisticated way of handling politics and warfare for their time. Unlike many other states around them, they quickly realized that victory in a single battle did not guarantee success in a war. Instead of exhausting their resources in campaigns that might lead nowhere, they often preferred to secure peace through treaties, tributes, and bribes. This method was not without risks, since as early as the 6th century, the historian Procopius noted that paying one enemy could tempt another to attack. Yet overall, the policy proved remarkably effective, allowing the empire to survive for centuries despite limited manpower and frequent civil strife, finally lasting until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. A crucial element of this diplomacy was the strategy of playing rivals against each other, a practice supported by bribes, forged correspondence, and even the instigation of rebellions. The emperor relied on an exceptional intelligence network known as the Office of Barbarians, which kept him constantly informed about political currents abroad. Other states, however, rarely appreciated this intricate mix of persuasion, threats, and deception. To them, the emperor's diplomacy appeared manipulative and untrustworthy, and over time, this gave Byzantium a poor reputation. For more than a millennium, chroniclers and later historians painted the empire as a nest of intrigues, and even today, the word Byzantine is sometimes used to describe complex and underhanded behavior. Yet behind this image of deception lay an essential reality. Such methods only worked because the empire maintained a powerful and reliable army. At its peak during the 10th and early 11th centuries, the Byzantine army was considered the best trained, best organized, best equipped, and best paid force in the known world. Although the Byzantines still called themselves Romans and preserved much of their imperial tradition, their military system had long since diverged from the structures of ancient Rome. By the late 6th and early 7th centuries, when Emperor Maurice composed his military treatise known as the Strategikon, most of the old Roman model had disappeared. The system described by Maurice remained in use with few changes until at least the late 10th century, and it was later echoed almost word for word in the Tactica written by Emperor Leo VI around 903. At that time, the fundamental unit of both infantry and cavalry was the banden, a term derived from the German word for banner, reflecting outside influences on the army's evolution during the 6th century. An infantry banden was organized into 16 small groups called lokagiai, each with 16 men led by an officer known as a lochagos or file leader. He was supported by subordinate officers with responsibilities over smaller groups, a leader of 10, a leader of 5, a leader of 4, and a file, closer who maintained discipline at the rear. 4 lochagiai together formed an alagion or winglet, and these were usually paired. In heavy infantry formations, 3/4 of the soldiers were spearmen called skoutaloi, while the rest were archers, often grouped together within their own lokagia or as a separate alagion. Light infantry and elite guards, on the other hand, were composed of a single type of troop, sometimes in smaller units of 8 rather than 16 men. This complex yet flexible organization reflected the balance Byzantium struck between tradition and innovation, a balance that underpinned both its military resilience and its unique approach to diplomacy. When the Strategikon was first written, a cavalry banden was organized into 3 groups known as hecatontarchia, each led by an officer called a hecatontarchos. Among them, the most senior served as second-in-command and bore the title Ilarches, while the overall commander of both infantry and cavalry banda was known as a komis or count. By the reign of Leo VI, this earlier structure had changed. The hecatontarchion had disappeared, and instead the cavalry banden was split into 6 alagia, most likely commanded by officers called pentakontarchai. These were paired in much the same way as infantry subunits, with each pair still overseen by a hecatontarchos, sometimes referred to as a kentarchos. Each alagion consisted of 50 men organized into 5 smaller groups of 10. These groups were led by 4 officers, the Dikarchos, Pentarchos, Tetrarchos, and Ouragos, who together directed 6 ordinary soldiers. On the battlefield, a cavalry unit of 10 typically formed in 2 files, 5 men deep. The Dikarchos and Pentarchos stood in the first rank, followed by a line of lancers, then 2 ranks of archers, and finally the Tetrarchos and Ouragos at the rear. All 4 officers themselves were lancers. By the opening of the 10th century, this meant that a standard infantry bandon usually contained 256 men, while a cavalry bandon counted around 300. Military treatises, however, note that numbers could vary between 200 and 400. Surplus personnel above official strength were rarely taken into the field and likely represented the wounded, the sick, or new recruits. In practice, it was more common for units to be under strength than over. These official figures did not include standard bearers, musicians, or officers ranking above lokagos or dikarchos. During the reign of Emperor Nicephorus II in the later 10th century, one of his writings mentions cavalry banda of only 50 men. This is usually taken as an error, with most scholars assuming that the term alagian was meant. Still, it is possible that by then the meaning of the word bandon had shifted. Some accounts also suggest that by the end of the 10th century, the smallest infantry group may have consisted of 10 rather than 16 men, with a typical mix of 7 spearmen to 3 archers. Nevertheless, by the late 11th century, Michael Pacellus was still describing infantry files of 16. Above the level of the bandon, the army was organized into larger formations. Several banda were grouped into moirai, led by moirarchai, or into draungoi, commanded by officers called draungarioi or draungarokomatai. Above them stood the turmai or marai, led by turmarchai or mararchai. A moira or drungos usually contained between 2 and 5 banda, while a turma or meros was made up of 3 moirai. In earlier centuries, such as when the Strategikon was compiled, a moira might field 2,000 to 3,000 men, and a meros as many as 6,000 to 7,000. By Leo VI's day, however, these numbers had dropped sharply. Even the strongest provincial army corps, known as themes, could raise only about 15,000 cavalry, while the smallest could provide no more than 4,000. Historical records from the year 838 even mention turmi numbering no more than 2,000 men, underscoring the reduction in size that had taken place by the middle of the 9th century. Byzantine soldiers seem to have enjoyed relatively good wages compared to many of their contemporaries. Provincial troops, known as thematics, are reported to have received a salary of 1 to 1.5 gold coins per month, which meant between 12 and 18 coins a year. This was equivalent to a quarter or a sixth of a pound of gold annually. Alongside their wages, these soldiers were also granted plots of land. Regulations introduced in the mid-10th century required that the value of these holdings be at least 2 pounds of gold for imperial sailors and possibly infantry, 4 pounds for sailors and cavalry of the themes, and rising to as much as 12 pounds for cavalrymen by the century's end. Some records also suggest that thematic troops received an extra coin for each year of service, up to 12 years. Yet not all accounts agree on how regularly payments were made. One Arab writer in the 9th century claimed that thematics were paid as rarely as every 3 to 6 years, while Constantine VII noted that they had once been divided into 4 groups, each receiving their pay in rotation every 4 years. This could mean that soldiers served in turns, spending a year in active duty within a 3 to 6 year cycle, ensuring that a limited corps of professionals was always on hand. Another possibility is that these irregular payments were tied to musters or training sessions. Apart from wages, soldiers on campaign were provided with rations, occasional bonuses, and shares of any plunder. Men disabled in battle were entitled to pensions, and widows sometimes received a lump sum compensation, which by the 9th century could reach 5 pounds of gold. Officers' salaries varied widely depending on rank and responsibility during the reign of Leo VI. A commander of 10 men, earned 1 pound of gold per year, while officers commanding 50 received 2. Leaders of entire banda earned 3 pounds, and generals of different grades received anywhere from 5 pounds up to 40, depending on their seniority. Salaries for intermediate officers such as centurions, moirarchs, and turma leaders are not precisely recorded, but they likely differed depending on which level of general they served under. These figures primarily reflect pay in the eastern provinces, since officers in the western provinces likely received lower wages drawn from local taxation rather than directly from the imperial treasury. Whether every soldier was always equipped as fully as military manuals describe remains doubtful, since illustrations of the period do not always support such uniformity. However, the quality of equipment issued was evidently very high. A seasoned commander writing in the late 11th century advised that the most important priority was ensuring cavalrymen had strong and reliable horses, properly fitting saddles, boots, and well-kept weapons. He observed that a rider with a fine mount and good gear would not only fight better, but also gain confidence and courage, while one poorly equipped with an ill-fitting saddle or weak horse would think only of survival and be quick to flee. This insight reflects the central role that proper pay, good horses, and quality equipment played in maintaining the effectiveness and morale of the Byzantine army. Our knowledge of Byzantine arms and armor from this period is supported by military manuals, documents, and a wealth of surviving illustrations. From these sources, it is clear that soldiers primarily used 3 kinds of protection: mail, scale, and lamellar, with lamellar being the most widespread. Lamellar armor consisted of small, rectangular plates, sometimes long and narrow, sometimes nearly square, pierced with holes and laced together in horizontal rows. These rows were then connected to one another, overlapping upwards, unlike scale armor, which overlapped downward. The plates were usually made of iron, but leather and horn are also mentioned. This produced a stiff but durable corselet known as the klabanion, a hallmark of Byzantine military gear. It was generally sleeveless or short-sleeved and waist-length, though some depictions from the 11th century show rare examples with long sleeves and skirts extending to the knees. Scale armor, less common than lamellar, was also rigid and inflexible. Illustrations suggest it usually protected only the torso and was sleeveless, and it can be difficult to distinguish from mail in artistic depictions. Male corselets, referred to as lorikia or kabai, appear to have been rarer still. These were usually knee-length and often had sleeves that reached the elbow or even the wrist, and male hoods were also used. In many cases, the klebanion is shown worn over a male shirt. Beneath or over these armors, padded and quilted garments of cotton, wool, felt, or leather were in frequent use. These were at least a finger thick and known by various names such as epilorikion, kabadion, and bambakion. They were sleeved garments, and at least the epilorikion and bambakion also included hoods. Typically, cavalrymen wore the epilorikion over their armor, while infantry used the kabadion beneath. Some sources even mention felt cloaks resistant to arrows, as well as thick felt caps. Since many corselets lacked sleeves and were relatively short, extra protection was provided by strips called terugis that hung from the shoulders and waist. These were made from quilted cloth, leather, or sometimes splinted materials. Helmets often had aventails of lamellar, leather, or cloth, though male aventails were also used, leaving only the eyes exposed. The arms and legs were defended by splinted vambraces and greaves, mostly made of iron, though leather, felt, and wood were sometimes used as alternatives. Even the tall, square-toed boots standard in Byzantine equipment provided some defensive protection. As for shields, by the 10th century the most common form became the kite shield. Infantry versions were about 50 inches long, while cavalry shields were slightly smaller, around 40. Early examples were fairly broad, about 2 feet at their widest point, while later versions became more tapered, resembling those later adopted in Western Europe, which themselves likely originated from Byzantine designs. By the 11th century, manuscripts frequently depict these kite-shaped shields, showing they had become the dominant type used by both infantry and cavalry alike. Among the secondary weapons used by Byzantine soldiers were the axe and the mace. The axe, apart from a type called the Sikurian, a continuation of the old Roman style, was not common among native troops, though it became the trademark weapon of the Varangian Guard. The mace, often referred to as the Manzikert or Bardukion, meaning sledgehammer, was primarily a cavalry weapon, though some lists of equipment include it for infantry as well. Cavalrymen generally carried it in a leather case fixed to their saddles. Missile weapons played a major role in the army, with bows and slings being the most widespread. The Byzantine bow was a composite type, usually about 4 feet long, with short but powerful limbs. It had originally been borrowed from the Huns and was employed by both infantry and cavalry. However, its use among Byzantine horsemen was gradually declining, with mounted archery increasingly provided by mercenaries from the east. In fact, the practice of archery in general had been waning since the 8th century. By the time of Leo VI, this decline was so serious that he complained in his military handbook that archery had been almost entirely neglected. He even tried to enforce compulsory practice, ordering every household to maintain a bow and 40 arrows, but his efforts seem to have had little success. As part of his reforms, Leo also adjusted the composition of heavy cavalry units, ensuring that 2 out of every 5 soldiers were archers who no longer carried lances. This was meant to put bows in the hands of skilled men while allowing the best lancers to focus on the spear. This arrangement echoed earlier recommendations by Emperor Maurice, who had suggested that heavily armored cavalry should divide their strength, with some specializing as archers and others as lancers. The fact that many archers were issued slings as well may indicate that the Byzantines did not fully trust their efficiency with the bow. The sling, known as the Sphenden, was sometimes replaced by a larger staff sling about 4 feet long, which launched projectiles with considerable force. Bows, slings, staff slings, javelins, and a type of bolt-firing weapon called the Solinarian were mainly carried by light infantry. The Solinarian appears in several sources and seems to have been an early form of crossbow. It is often mentioned alongside a quiver filled with short arrows known as mela. Contemporary texts describe it as highly effective, able to launch bolts with such speed that no armor could resist them and so fast that the eye could barely follow their flight. It was also praised for its long range. This weapon, like the arqueballista of earlier Roman armies, was associated with light troops. For reasons not entirely clear, the Solinarian fell out of use around the mid-10th century, but reappeared in the late 11th or early 12th century, probably through contact with the Normans. Another weapon worth noting is the rhomphaea, which many Byzantine guardsmen are said to have carried. Its precise form remains uncertain, as the detailed military manuals of the time do not mention it. Nonetheless, written references and limited archaeological finds suggest that it was a distinctive weapon resembling a falx, with a slightly curved blade, roughly equal in length to its handle. This would have made it a powerful cutting weapon, feared for its reach and striking force. At the heart of the Byzantine army during this period stood the elite guard units stationed in Constantinople. Chief among these were the cavalry regiments of the Scolai, Excubiti, Arithmos, and Ikonatoi, which together were known as the Tagmata. In a broader sense, however, the term could also include other units based in the capital, such as the Numeri, the Hetaerea, and even parts of the imperial fleet when assigned to the emperor's personal service. Of the 4 main regiments, the Scoli held the highest rank and was probably the oldest. Records from the early 5th century mention 7 divisions of the Scoli, while Procopius states that in his time, the regiment numbered around 3,500 men. By the 9th century, their strength may have increased to 4,000, according to figures preserved by the Arab writer Kodama, who drew on earlier sources. Another Arab scholar, Ibn Khordadbeh, interpreted the numbers differently, describing 4 divisions of cavalry serving the emperor, each with 6,000 soldiers and an equal number of attendants. If accurate, this would suggest either 1,500 men in each regiment or 6,000 per regiment, depending on interpretation. Some Byzantine sources support a lower figure, mentioning 30 companies under the schole's command, each led by a comes. If these companies were smaller than the theoretical maximum, their total strength would have been closer to 1,500 men, which seems more realistic. The Sholai, like the other regiments of the Tagmata, was commanded by a domestikos, assisted by a topodoretes as second-in-command. An exception was the arithmos, or vigla, which was under the authority of a drongarios. By the mid-9th century, the office of domestic of the Sholai had grown in prestige, outranking all other officers except the general of the powerful Anatolikon theme. In the absence of the emperor, the holder of this position acted as commander-in-chief of the entire army. This office was later occupied by important figures such as Alexios Komnenos, who went on to become emperor in 1081. By then, however, the regiment he commanded was no longer the same as the original skole, as indicated by the presence of foreign mercenaries within its ranks, noted by his daughter Anna Komnene. Second in seniority to the skole was the excubiti, a regiment probably created during the reign of Leo I in the 5th century. Initially commanded by a comes, it too came under a domestikos from the 8th century onward. By the end of the 9th century, this office outranked the generals of the Western provincial armies. Sources from the late 8th century mention at least 18 companies within the regiment, though their exact size is unclear, and they were probably smaller than the standard numbers outlined in military manuals. The domestic of the excubiti also oversaw medical personnel, known as scriboles, who were attached to the thematic armies. The 3rd regiment of the Tagmata was known as both the arithmos and the vigla, the latter being the more common designation. It is attested as early as the mid-6th century, and some scholars have suggested that it may have originated even earlier, perhaps connected to guard units formed under Arcadius in the late 4th century. Unlike the other regiments, it was commanded by a draungarios rather than a domestikos, though its subdivisions were still led by comates. The vigla had special responsibilities during campaigns. They guarded the emperor's tent at night, transmitted his orders, and supervised prisoners of war. The youngest of the 4 regiments was the Ikonatoi, founded in the early 9th century by Emperor Nikephoros I. Curiously, some contemporary Arab writers do not list it at all, instead mentioning a unit called the foederati, an older corps that had existed since at least the 7th century and may have been replaced by the Ikonatoi later on. The Hetairea, a guard corps of foreign mercenaries, eventually became prominent as well and often served alongside the Tagmata. As for the size of these elite units, figures vary considerably. Some accounts claim each regiment had 4,000 men, while others suggest totals ranging from 1,500 to 6,000. A late 10th century source notes that the emperor should be accompanied on campaign by at least 8,200 cavalry, including 1,000 men of the Hetairea, which would leave a minimum of 7,200 for the Tagmata. This figure may represent only the forces the emperor took with him from the capital, as detachments from these regiments were also stationed in provinces such as Macedonia, Thrace, and Opsikion. These outposts were typically commanded by lieutenants serving under the domestikoi, ensuring that the empire's elite troops remained both a central guard for the emperor and a mobile reserve ready to reinforce the provinces when needed. By the later 10th century, detachments of the Tagmata were no longer confined to Constantinople, but had been stationed throughout the provinces, sometimes under the command of dukes rather than their traditional officers. During the Great Expedition against Crete in 949, provincial elements of these regiments are recorded: 493 from the Skole, 869 from the Vigla, 700 from the Excubiti, and 456 from the Ikonatoi. Another important unit was the numeri, a large infantry regiment permanently based in the capital. One source gives its strength as 4,000 men, a figure that seems plausible given the size of Constantinople and the need to defend it, although even this number may have been insufficient for such a task. Evidence suggests the regiment was much older than its first secure mention, and its organization followed a pattern similar to the cavalry guard regiments. It was commanded by a domestikos with a topoterides as deputy, but unlike the cavalry, its companies were led not by counts but by tribunes, a title harking back to Roman tradition. The authority of the domestic of the numeri appears to have been confined within the Theodosian walls of the city, since the long wall of Anastasius was under a different officer known as the Count of the Walls, who likely commanded his own garrison. The Hetairaia Basilic was another corps closely connected with the Tagmata. It emerges in the mid-9th century, probably as a renamed continuation of the older foederati. While one source attributes it a strength of 4,000, this is likely an exaggeration, with other accounts giving a more credible figure of around 1,000. Its name, derived from the word companions, can be translated as the emperor's companions in arms, or the emperor's retinue. This regiment was composed largely of mercenaries, although native Greeks also served in its ranks, and it included both cavalry and infantry. A detachment always accompanied the emperor outside the capital, whether on campaign or even on hunts. Initially, it consisted of 3 divisions, the Great, Middle, and Little Hetairaia, each commanded by its own officer, or hetaiarch. The Little Hetairaia was later abolished in the time of Basil I, or shortly after. Some parts of the regiment were also posted in the provinces. Other mercenary formations, often grouped under the general heading of Hetairaia, also played an important role. Among these were the Khazars, recruited from a people of Turkic or Hunnic descent living in the Caucasus, and the Farganoi, drawn from Central Asian Turks near the region of Fergana. Around the year 903, it was noted that as many as 10,000 Khazars and Farganoi accompanied the emperor in ceremonial parades. Like the regular Hetairaia, they also followed him on campaigns and hunting expeditions. Another associated corps, the Muglavitai, may have been composed of mercenaries of North African origin. All of these auxiliary forces were cavalry. Serving in the Hetairaia was regarded as a highly desirable privilege, one that had to be purchased. Contemporary records reveal that admission into the Great Hetairaia required a fee of at least 16 pounds of gold, the Middle Hetairaia 10 pounds, while enrollment among the Khazars and Farganoi was set at 7 pounds. This practice highlights not only the prestige of these guard regiments, but also their semi-professional and mercenary character within the Byzantine military system. One of the most famous elite formations of Byzantium was the Varangian Guard, the regiment best remembered today and surrounded by a certain aura of legend. Much of their fascination lies in the striking contrast they presented: hard-drinking, battle-hardened warriors from the distant north, serving the Christian emperor of the East amid the grandeur of Constantinople's palaces and ceremonies. Later sagas from Scandinavia and Iceland are full of stories about their exploits, although their reputation as noble guardians has sometimes been exaggerated. Some modern historians even argue that they were valued more for their toughness and willingness to act as enforcers than for refined military discipline. The name Varangian most likely came from an Old Norse word meaning pledge, describing men bound by loyalty, shared rules, and equal division of spoils. This was a fitting label for Viking adventurers who alternated between trading and fighting. Scandinavian groups, especially Swedes who had settled in Russia, first arrived in Constantinople in the early 9th century. Soon afterward, treaties began to establish their role in imperial service. And throughout the 10th century, Rus auxiliaries fought alongside Byzantines on expeditions to Crete against Arab armies, and even on naval campaigns in Italy. Still, these were temporary levies rather than a permanent corps. Only in 988, When Emperor Basil II received 6,000 warriors from Prince Vladimir of Kiev, did the Varangians become a permanent guard. Basil valued their loyalty because he distrusted his native soldiers, and writers of the time stressed that the Varangians considered their allegiance to the emperor almost sacred, treating it as a tradition passed down from father to son. Despite this loyalty, there were moments of friction. Harald Hardrada, the future king of Norway who served in the Guard during the 1040s, was accused of misusing imperial funds and, according to saga tradition, even took part in blinding Emperor Michael V. Other episodes mention drunken guardsmen assaulting emperors or demanding extraordinary payments in times of crisis, such as during the siege of Constantinople in 1204. Their pay was, in fact, much higher than that of other mercenaries. 10 to 15 gold coins a month, in addition to campaign bonuses, spoils of war, and even the peculiar custom of seizing treasures from the emperor's chambers upon a new ruler's accession. Harold himself returned to the north with enormous wealth collected during his service. From the late 11th century onward, the makeup of the Guard began to change. After the Norman conquest of England, many Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Danish exiles entered Byzantine service. References from the 1070s onward show Englishmen within the Guard, and by 1081 they were certainly present at the Battle of Durazzo. For a time, however, Scandinavians still formed the majority, with Danes and Norsemen continuing to be recorded in service under Alexios I and mentioned in contemporary accounts. Byzantine authors often describe the Guard as axe-bearing barbarians, a name reflecting their famous two-handed axes, though they were also called those who hang their swords from the right shoulder and sometimes Tauroscythians. The commander of the Guard was formerly known as the Akaluthos, or follower, emphasizing his constant closeness to the emperor. Like his men, he was usually of northern origin, though interpreters were attached to the regiment to ease communication. In practice, many Varangians seem to have learned Greek themselves. Several leaders are known by name. Ragnvald, a Swede remembered on a memorial stone as commander of warriors in the land of the Greeks; Harald Hardrada, who, though not the Akaluthos, commanded hundreds of men before becoming king of Norway; and Nampites, an officer in the late 11th century whose name likely meant biter of corpses or bird of prey. These figures illustrate the mixture of legend, violence, and loyalty that made the Varangian Guard one of Byzantium's most distinctive military institutions. The system of themes, or provincial army districts, emerged in the 7th century, most likely under Constans II and Constantine IV, as a way to defend Asia Minor against Arab attacks. By the 10th century, each theme was governed by a strategos, who commanded both military forces and local administration with the help of officials handling finance, law, and taxation. These troops were soldier farmers who held land in exchange for providing military service. Estates were hereditary as long as the heirs continued to serve, and wealthier landowners supplied better-equipped cavalry, while poorer farmers sometimes had to pool resources to outfit a single soldier. Those unable to fulfill obligations were downgraded to irregular garrison duty. Themes were often created by dividing older ones or by establishing new provinces on the frontier. Smaller frontier districts, called klaisurai, were manned by local border families who lived in semi-feudal style. Thematic forces were organized into larger formations, turmai or marai, broken down into moirai and then banda. Cavalry was the backbone of these armies, with up to 4,000 first-class horsemen per theme, heavily armed and armored. In emergencies, emperors preferred to call on elite cavalry from neighboring themes rather than rely on second-class troops. Infantry also existed in large numbers, though details are scarce. Some were likely conscripts rather than landholders, and sources suggest a single theme could field as many as 24,000 infantry, many of them light troops. While the Western and naval themes were considered weaker, the Eastern themes could together muster about 30,000 cavalry without exhausting their reserves. This shows how the thematic system, combining military service with landholding, became the foundation of Byzantine provincial defense for centuries. Over time, the thematic system began to collapse as strategoi and senior officers, who had accumulated vast estates, turned their districts into semi-independent holdings. The farmer soldiers who once formed the backbone of the themes were gradually absorbed into these estates, effectively becoming part of private armies. The imperial government, unable to stop this process, was forced to grant more privileges to the aristocracy, including tax exemptions, in exchange for their military support. As a result, small landowners disappeared, and the fighting strength of the themes dwindled. By the late 10th century, sources suggest that many Eastern themes could raise no more than 3,000 men, far fewer than in earlier times. Emperor Nikephoros II, himself from the military aristocracy, responded by reducing or disbanding native thematic troops and replacing them with mercenaries. By the mid-11th century, many musters included Slavs, Bulgars, Armenians, Uzis, Franks, Varangians, and other hired soldiers, while the few remaining native Byzantines were poorly armed, lacking proper equipment and horses. Even elite themes like the Anatolikon were described as impoverished and ineffective. The decline was worsened by the ongoing power struggle between provincial generals and the imperial bureaucracy. After Basil II's death in 1025, revolts became frequent, and ambitious generals repeatedly challenged the throne. In response, bureaucrats dismantled theme armies, converted military service into tax payments, cut soldiers' pay, and executed rebellious commanders. Under Constantine IX, for example, the entire army of the Iberian theme, around 5,000 men, was dissolved and replaced with a tax levy. These policies, combined with civil wars, aristocratic land grabbing, and the erosion of military smallholdings, severely weakened the Byzantine army. By the time of the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in 1071, the system was already hollowed out, and the loss only accelerated an irreversible decline. The weakening of the thematic armies led to a sharp rise in the use of mercenaries, who became an essential part of Byzantine forces. By the reign of Nikephoros II, most light cavalry were already drawn from Asiatic horsemen, and by the mid-11th century, mercenaries made up more than half of the army. Many came from Turkish groups such as the Patsinaks, who were especially prominent. But there were also Cumans, Uzes, Alans, Normans, Franks, and others. Chroniclers of the First Crusade describe Constantinople as filled with soldiers from every corner of the known world, including Italians, Venetians, Englishmen, Slavs, Arabs, and more. These foreign troops often served in their own units under native leaders, in the manner of allied contingents once used by Rome. Their numbers could be very large. 15,000 Patsinaks were hired in 1049, 3,000 Normans fought for Byzantium after Manzikert, and in 1078, the empire fielded thousands of Alans, Normans, Seljuk Turks, and others. On some occasions, even greater forces were mustered, such as 40,000 Cumans in 1091. While mercenaries strengthened Byzantine armies, they also created risks. Their loyalty was not always secure, especially among Frankish units, who often demanded higher rewards. If payments were delayed, mercenaries could turn on their employers, switch sides in the middle of campaigns, or pillage Byzantine lands. Thus, although indispensable, they also added new strains to the empire's already fragile military system. By the mid-11th century, the collapse of Armenia's defenses left the region open to Seljuk conquest, and by 1067 it had fallen into their hands. From there, Turkish raids spread deep into Asia Minor, threatening the empire's core lands. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes concluded that the only way to secure the frontier was to retake Armenia. In 1071, an opportunity arose when Sultan Alp Arslan marched south to attack Damascus and Egypt, leaving his forces scattered. Romanos assembled a vast army at Erzurum, its size exaggerated by some sources, but undoubtedly one of the largest Byzantine forces ever fielded. It included native Byzantine troops, Varangians, the Tagmata cavalry, and a wide range of foreign contingents: Normans, Armenians, Georgians, Slavs, Alans, Patsinaks, and others. Yet many were poorly trained or unreliable, and discipline was already breaking down. Skirmishes with Seljuk detachments, especially under a commander known as Saundak, weakened the Byzantines further. Some allied forces withdrew, others deserted, and large parts of the army were tied up with supply duties. By the time the two sides faced each other near Manzikert, Romanos' force was greatly reduced while Alp Arslan's smaller but cohesive army had regrouped. On the eve of battle, the Sultan sent envoys offering peace, but Romanos rejected the proposal, convinced he had to achieve a decisive victory while his army still outnumbered the enemy. His generals advised caution, but Romanos pressed ahead, believing delay would sap morale and risk further desertions. With that decision, he committed the Byzantine army to the confrontation that would become one of the most disastrous defeats in its history. On August 18th, as both armies prepared for battle, the Byzantines suffered another setback when a group of Uz mercenaries deserted to the Seljuks. The following day, Emperor Romanos IV drew up his forces in two lines, the right wing composed of Eastern themes, the center led personally by the emperor with the Tagmata, and the left under Nikephoros Bryennios, with Western troops and auxiliaries. The reserve, commanded by Andronikos Doukas, an enemy of Romanos, consisted of heavy cavalry and nobles, but was left unused. Crucially, no soldiers were left to protect the camp. The Byzantine advance across the plain met little resistance as the Seljuks executed a controlled retreat. By late afternoon, fearing for his unguarded camp, Romanos ordered a withdrawal. The signal, however, was misunderstood, and confusion spread across the lines. Andronikos Doukas fueled the chaos by spreading a false rumor that the emperor had fallen. At that moment, Alp Arslan launched a decisive cavalry charge, smashing into the disordered Byzantine ranks. The right wing collapsed quickly, the left resisted longer but was eventually overwhelmed, while the reserve abandoned the field without fighting. Only the center held, where Romanos fought bravely despite being wounded, until he was finally captured, the first Byzantine emperor ever taken prisoner by a Muslim army. With his fall, the remaining resistance crumbled, and the Seljuks pursued the fleeing soldiers through the night. Manzikert marked the collapse of the traditional Byzantine army. Most of the elite Tagmatic regiments were destroyed, and the weakened eastern themes were wiped out, leaving Anatolia exposed to Turkish conquest. In the years that followed, emperors like Michael VII and Nikephoros III increasingly turned to mercenary forces, Normans, Turks, Cumans, and Patzinaks, to defend the empire. With the treasury drained, soldiers were often compensated not with steady pay, but with land grants known as pronoiai, which also provided tax relief and additional income. Though more profitable for individual soldiers than the old thematic estates, this system greatly reduced tax revenues, making it harder for the empire to sustain a large professional army. In the immediate aftermath, remnants of the Tagmata still lingered, but they soon disappeared. New units were formed to rebuild the central army, such as the Chomatnoi, the Immortals, reportedly 10,000 strong, and the Archon Topoloi, recruited from orphans of officers. Alongside these were household troops known as the Vestiaritai, the Varangian Guard, and new formations of Turkish origin, like the Vardariats and the Turkopoloi. Together, these made up the backbone of Alexios I's army. Despite these efforts, the army was a fragile coalition. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081, the Varangians initially fought well but were overwhelmed. While allied contingents like the Serbs fled without fighting, the defeat nearly cost Alexios his life and forced him to rebuild his forces by drawing on private wealth and confiscating church property. Though he later won notable victories against the Patzinaks at Livonian in 1091 and the Seljuks at Philomelian in 1116, the revival he achieved was short-lived. Under his successors, the Byzantine army never fully recovered from Manzikert. The defeat permanently ended the empire's military dominance and its standing as a world power. By the late 11th century, the old oval skuta shield was gradually replaced by the kite shield, which became standard among heavy infantry by the 1080s. This change owed much to Norman influence as well as shifting battlefield tactics, since tightly drilled infantry formations were falling out of use. Nevertheless, unarmored troops could still be seen with smaller round shields well into the 13th century. Depictions of scutitoi from the 10th century usually show them wearing a lamellar cuirass, often sleeveless and reaching the hips. These were typically fastened at the front, back, or sides, and sometimes worn like a poncho. Their helmets were of spangen helm construction, fitted with a metal ring for attaching crests, though such decorations appear rarely in illustrations. Byzantine troops often wore uniforms in red or blue, though green, mauve, and purple also appear in sources. Units were mainly distinguished by their shield patterns, while cavalry might be identified by lance pennants, crests, and banners. Beards and mustaches became more common by the later part of the century, though some remained clean-shaven. Another type of soldier, the peltast, began appearing in the late 10th century. These men were lighter equipped than the scutitoi, wearing padded armor such as the bombachion, sometimes with open helmets. Their shields were usually round rather than oval, and their weapons included spears, javelins, and the curved paramerian sword instead of the traditional straight blade. The emergence of peltasts may have reflected financial strains, since their lighter equipment was cheaper to supply, though in practice, they often filled the role between heavy and light infantry. Military manuals describe the ideal equipment of scutitoi as including mail or lamellar cuirasses, sometimes reinforced with padded garments like the epauleurikion. Greaves and vambraces were usually issued, and though earlier sources state that only the first ranks wore such armor, by the later 10th century it seems to have become more common. Their primary weapon was the long Contarian spear, often thrust at cavalry or thrown at infantry, while some carried heavy javelins called manalia. Swords, sabers, or small axes might also be issued. Their shields were large oval scuta, brightly painted and slightly curved, forming the main visual identifier of these soldiers. The Byzantine army also relied heavily on servants and support staff. Each cavalryman or group of infantrymen was assigned a servant to handle baggage, drive mule carts, and dig fortifications. These helpers carried basic tools for camp construction and could defend themselves with slings. In addition, the emperor's army required vast logistical support, with hundreds of pack mules transporting not only weapons and equipment, but also luxury items such as silverware, tapestries, and even portable chapels. By the 11th to 13th centuries, lightly armored foot soldiers became increasingly common, fighting in tight formations despite their lack of heavy protection. They typically carried light-throwing spears like the Apulian, reflecting the steady decline in the role of heavy infantry in Byzantine tactics. By the late 11th century, the older oval scuta shield was still in limited use, but most heavy infantry had adopted the kite shield, a change influenced by Norman warfare as well as evolving battlefield tactics. Light infantry, or psiloi, relied primarily on the composite bow drawn to the chest, though some carried javelins, slings, or even crossbows. Archers usually had a bow case and quiver with around 40 arrows, and occasionally a small axe for close defense. Armor was rare among them, though some manuals advised issuing mail or lamellar cuirasses when possible. A few also carried small round shields, despite certain regulations discouraging their use. Later reforms under Nikephoros II called for archers to be better supplied, with multiple quivers, extra bows, spare strings, and sidearms such as swords and axes. Heavy cavalry, the backbone of the Byzantine army, were typically armed with either the long Contarian lance or the bow. Each lancer might be issued 2 spears, while mounted archers carried their quiver at the hip and bow case slung at the side. Some riders substituted javelins if bows were unavailable. Officers often carried maces as symbols of rank. Shields varied in size, from small round targets to larger kite shields, the latter becoming increasingly common. Even bow-armed cavalry often strapped small shields to their arms for protection. From the mid-11th century onwards, cavalry equipment shown in manuscripts depicts kite shields, helmets with aventails, and scale or mail cuirasses with protective pedaruges at the shoulders. Horses were fitted with standard harnesses, usually dyed red or black, and saddlecloths, often in shades of red. Standards, known as banda, were carried into battle, their size and shape varying according to unit strength, with crosses embroidered in gold and silver being the most common symbol. The revival of the super-heavy klebanophoroi under Nikephoros II represented the return of true cataphracts not seen since late Roman times. These cavalrymen wore lamellar cuirasses with long sleeves over padded protection, helmets with multi-layered mail hoods, and splint armor for arms and legs, with gauntlets and metal overshoes completing their equipment. Their horses were also heavily protected with oxhide or lamellar barding, leaving only minimal parts exposed. On the battlefield, they fought in wedge formations, with hundreds of lancers supported by a smaller number of mounted archers. Because of their immense cost, klebanophoroi were probably limited to elite guard units, and they likely disappeared after the defeat at Manzikert, marking the end of this formidable but expensive tradition. Byzantine illustrations from as early as the 4th century show figures very similar to later guardsmen. One such example, dressed in ceremonial uniform with a red cloak and embroidered panels on his tunic, was likely an officer of the Hetaeria, or one of the elite Tagmata regiments. The emperor himself, when depicted in full armor with crown and gold embellishments, was shown in parade attire rather than battlefield gear, artistic convention rather than reality. In combat, emperors probably wore equipment similar to that of their professional soldiers, though richly decorated versions of military armbands, sometimes of iron or scale, were indeed used during this period. Among the imperial attendants were the basilikoi anthropoi, a corps of semi-military court officials that included sword-bearers, bodyguards, and ceremonial officers. They were commanded by the protospatharios and carried imperial arms on parade. The candidatoi, one of the oldest groups within this corps, wore white uniforms with gold neck chains, a tradition stretching back to late Roman times. On formal occasions, they could be mounted, clad in gilded armor and white cloaks, while their origins lay in selections from the scholai, the senior guard unit. Foreign mercenaries also formed a vital part of Byzantine forces. By the 10th century, many Rus warriors, influenced by Slavic and Asiatic styles, served the empire. They often wore linen tunics, baggy striped trousers, and boots, sometimes decorated with tattoos in steppe fashion. Their armor was usually mail, and weapons included spear, axe, sword, and dagger. Distinctive Slav-style helmets and rectangular shields added to their appearance. These Rus, tall, fair-haired, and often bearded, left a strong impression in Byzantine sources. The most famous foreign unit was the Varangian Guard. Their trademark was the heavy two-handed axe, though they also carried swords and spears. While Byzantine sources mention the rhomphaia, sagas stress the prominence of the axe. In practice, many Varangians brought their own Scandinavian arms and gradually adopted Byzantine armor as their service continued. Anna Komnene described them as heavily armored, and archaeological as well as literary evidence shows that they supplemented their equipment with vambraces, greaves, and circular shields, later replaced in some cases by kite shields. In ceremonial roles, Varangians could wear richly decorated cloaks, helmets, and shields, gifts from the emperor himself. The scarlet cloak and gold inlaid sword of Boli Bolason, described in Icelandic sagas, show the high honor and wealth that service in the guard could bestow. Light cavalry, known as trapezitai, appear in manuals as unarmored riders armed with swords, long spears, and several javelins, sometimes also functioning as horse archers. Their shields ranged from large infantry ovals to small circular targets, and they filled the role of mobile skirmishers on the battlefield. Mercenary contingents became increasingly important. The Pechenegs, or Patzinaks, a Turkic people, often served the empire in the 11th century, sometimes even acting as a form of provincial police. Their main weapon was the composite bow, but they also used javelins, sabers, axes, and even lassos to capture enemies on horseback. Chiefs and their retinues wore lamellar armor, though common warriors often went without. After the defeat at Manzikert, the Byzantines even recruited Seljuk Turks themselves. These fierce horse archers were valued for their skill but were dangerous allies. They typically wore brightly colored garments with wide skirts and diagonal flaps, carried quivers, bows, swords, and often maces, and favored small shields. While some donned captured mail, most fought unarmored. Normans also entered Byzantine service during the 11th century, though their loyalty was uncertain. They wore heavy mail armor, long kite shields, and wielded lances and swords. Byzantine writers, including Anna Komnene, described Norman equipment as nearly invulnerable, able to withstand even the most powerful arrows. While some adopted elements of Byzantine gear, they generally retained their distinctive Western style, making them both valuable allies and dangerous rivals.